It started with an email no one was ever supposed to see. Not a press release. Not a carefully crafted statement approved by advisors. Just a private message from Prince Harry, sent to the last man anyone expected to be pulled into royal drama, Ben Affleck. And according to insiders, Ben didn't just ignore it. He allegedly trashed it. Out loud. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In front of people who absolutely should not have heard what came next. But before we get there, ask yourself this. Why would a Hollywood icon, someone who has survived scandals, career collapses, rehab, and global media storms, react so sharply to a simple request? Was it disrespect? Was it timing? Or did the email reveal something much deeper about where Prince Harry stands in the world right now? The truth is uncomfortable. Because this wasn't just about attending the F1 Grand Prix in Las Vegas. It was about status, visibility, desperation, power shifting from royalty to celebrity. And for the first time, the prince who once walked into any room with global authority suddenly found himself on the outside, asking for a way in. But let's rewind, not to the email, but to the moment that made it necessary. For months, Harry's social currency had been quietly slipping. Not publicly, not dramatically, just slowly enough that most people didn't notice. Invitations began to thin. Names that once answered immediately now took days, or never replied at all. Hollywood's fascination turned into hesitation, then into something worse. Distance. Because in Hollywood, silence is not neutrality. Silence is rejection. And here's the question most people never ask. What happens when a prince loses the one thing a title can't guarantee? Access. That's why the F1 Grand Prix mattered. It wasn't just another event. It was the place where the most photographed, most powerful, most untouchable names in the world were converging for 3 days of cameras, luxury, and billion-dollar networking. Everyone who mattered would be there. Everyone Harry needed to impress. Everyone who could change the narrative with a single photo. So when he reached out to Ben Affleck, someone who has been in Hollywood long enough to know how quickly reputations can collapse, it wasn't random. It was strategic. But here's the twist. Harry thought he was reaching out to an ally. Instead, he walked straight into a moment that insiders are still talking about. Because what Ben allegedly said wasn't just dismissive. It was humiliating. And according to the source who claims to have witnessed it, the reaction in the room was so tense that even Ben paused, realizing the weight of what he had just done. But why would Ben react like that? Why would someone known for being private, thoughtful, and careful with his words suddenly turn sharp? Was it personal? Or was Harry's request the final straw in a series of behind-the-scenes missteps that the public never saw? Because here's what most people don't know. This wasn't the first time Harry tried to leverage a Hollywood connection and watched it backfire. There were earlier moments, earlier invitations, earlier conversations that didn't go the way he expected. Moments that hinted at a bigger shift. Prince Harry was no longer the one being chased. He was the one asking. And in Hollywood, nothing is more dangerous than appearing desperate. Now imagine being Ben Affleck, mid-conversation, surrounded by colleagues, scrolling through an inbox, and suddenly seeing an email from a prince asking to join him at one of the most exclusive events of the year. Most people would assume that's flattering. A compliment. An honor. So why did Ben allegedly do the opposite? Better question. Who was standing behind him when he opened it? Because this is the part no one talks about. It wasn't the email that caused the problem. It was the audience. Someone heard. Someone laughed. And someone repeated it to the exact person who should never have found out. Which means the leak didn't start with malice. It started with a reaction. And that reaction spread faster than the email itself. But here's the real turning point. Harry never expected to be the punchline. Not in Hollywood. Not in private. Not in any room. Once, people lowered their voices when he walked in. Now they lowered their voices when his name came up. And the F1 request wasn't just a message. It was a test. A test to see whether he still had pull. A test to see whether old respect still existed. A test to see whether doors were still open. But the moment Ben read the email, everything changed. Because what he allegedly said next wasn't just a rejection. It sent a message. A message that traveled from Las Vegas circles to Hollywood insiders, all the way back to the UK. A message Harry never expected to hear. And the worst part? He didn't find out immediately. Someone else did. And when they reacted, The situation went from embarrassing to explosive. The thing about emails is that they leave a digital trail. Once you hit send, there's no taking it back. But Harry's email wasn't just sent, it was exposed. And in the world of Hollywood and high-profile royals, exposure is equivalent to fireworks going off in a library, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. By the time the message landed in Ben's inbox, tensions were already high. Ben had been juggling a series of public appearances, a movie premiere that hadn't gone according to plan, and private matters that, for the first time in his career, made him wary of letting anyone too close. His career had survived scandals and rumors, but there was a distinct line between his private life and the public circus. And this email? It blurred that line in ways nobody could have anticipated. According to sources, the email started politely. Harry made what seemed like a normal request. He wanted to join Ben at the Las Vegas F1 Grand Prix. On paper, it sounded simple enough. But here's the kicker, it wasn't simple at all. Beneath the surface, the email carried subtext. A mix of aspiration, urgency, and desperation. To the untrained eye, it may have looked like a friendly invitation. To Ben Affleck, insiders claim, it read like a misstep, a breach of etiquette, and an unintentional comedy all rolled into one. Can you imagine reading that? Not just seeing a request from a prince, but feeling the weight of expectation and scrutiny in every word. And then, according to sources, the email wasn't read in private, it was glanced at in the company of others. That's when the situation spiraled. A laugh, a murmur. Someone whispered, "He really thinks this will work?" And just like that, Harry's carefully considered approach started to unravel. The irony here is brutal. A man who has spent a lifetime in the public eye, adept at managing perception, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of judgment in a space where influence and reputation were currency. But let's pause for a second. Why does this matter? Why would the world care that Ben Affleck allegedly mocked an email from Prince Harry? Because it isn't just about the email. It's about perception, power, and the invisible hierarchy that governs both Hollywood and royalty. In both worlds, your position is dictated not just by your accomplishments, but by how others perceive your presence. And in this scenario, Harry's email was more than a request, it was a test of relevance. Consider this, a single misstep can trigger ripple effects. A slight misjudgment can shift alliances, affect invitations, and even change who you sit next to at a high-profile event. And while Harry may have viewed the email as a polite approach, Ben's reaction, mocked, as insiders claim, was a loud signal. Your request? Not happening. That signal, according to those who were close to the situation, sent tremors through networks that extend far beyond Las Vegas. Hollywood is a world that thrives on gossip, on inside jokes, on subtle power plays. And when a prince, no less, walks into that web, unprepared for its subtleties, the results can be devastating. That's exactly what happened here. Every reaction, every whisper, every smirk became a story, a moment to analyze and dissect. And for Harry, who had once commanded rooms with his royal status, it was a brutal reminder. Influence isn't just inherited, it has to be earned. Then there's the human element. Emotions ran high. Pride, embarrassment, humiliation. For Harry, it wasn't just about missing the F1 event. It was about realizing that public perception can shift overnight. And for Ben, it wasn't about cruelty. It was a response shaped by years of navigating fame, boundaries, and personal space. The clash between a prince seeking connection and a celebrity defending his territory was inevitable, but the fallout? That was unpredictable. Imagine being the observer. Imagine witnessing a historic collision of Hollywood and royalty in the form of a single email. What would you feel? Shock? Curiosity? Empathy? That mix of emotions is exactly what has kept this story alive behind closed doors, circulating among insiders, waiting for a moment when the public could finally glimpse the drama. And here's the part most people miss. This wasn't a one-off. There were rumors, whispers of previous attempts by Harry to engage with Hollywood heavyweights. Invitations sent, calls made, and subtle maneuvers to secure a place in events that matter. Each attempt, successful or not, painted a picture. The prince is no longer untouchable. Influence has its limits. And when Ben allegedly trashed that email, It was a public reminder that even a royal can be denied. What followed that moment? A scramble behind the scenes. Advisors weighing options. PR teams drafting statements. Close friends offering counsel. And a growing sense that the F1 Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It was the battleground for reputations. But the story doesn't stop there. Because what happened after the email was read and allegedly mocked set off a chain of events nobody could have predicted. Private messages leaked, reactions amplified, and the one person Harry trusted most for feedback found himself tangled in a scandal that wasn't his doing. This is the moment where our story pivots from simple embarrassment to high-stakes drama, where the line between Hollywood and royalty blurs, where an email transforms from a request into a symbol of missed opportunities, of shifting alliances, and of a world that rewards confidence over status. And the kicker? The fallout didn't just stay in Las Vegas. It traveled. It reached people who, for years, had been watching every move, waiting for a crack in the facade. It reached journalists, insiders, and yes, eventually, the public. The story begins not with an email, but with a sense of urgency that Harry had been carrying for months. Anyone who thinks that a prince can float through life on title alone has never tried to remain relevant in a world where attention is currency and influence is fleeting. Harry, once a fixture of international headlines and global fascination, suddenly found himself navigating a world that had subtly shifted beneath his feet. Invitations that once arrived on silver platters now trickled in, if at all. The social media spotlight he once commanded had dimmed, and Hollywood, in particular, was a notoriously unforgiving stage. But why Hollywood? Why Ben Affleck? These weren't arbitrary choices. Harry had spent years cultivating a network of high-profile friends and associates, people who could help maintain his influence and open doors that mattered for global visibility. He wasn't looking for a casual hangout. He was looking for a strategic presence at the Las Vegas F1 Grand Prix, a trifecta of fame, wealth, and media spectacle. He wanted to be seen, remembered, and respected, and Hollywood provided both the stage and the gatekeepers. Ben Affleck was one of those gatekeepers, not just because of his fame, but because of the aura of credibility and discretion he carried. Ben had survived the pitfalls of Hollywood, navigating scandals, tabloid hysteria, and public scrutiny with a measured patience. He represented both insider access and subtle influence, exactly what Harry needed to regain his footing. Yet there was another layer to this attempt, a personal urgency that rarely reached public ears. Harry had been under the microscope since his departure from royal duties. Every social engagement, every public appearance was analyzed, dissected, and compared to his previous life. A simple request to join an event like the F1 wasn't just logistical, it was a statement. It was a signal that he still mattered in elite social circles, that his influence wasn't entirely gone. And then there was timing. Las Vegas, known for its excess, glamour, and star-studded events, provided the perfect backdrop. The F1 Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It was a networking goldmine, a media spectacle that demanded visibility and a chance to secure strategic alliances. The event attracted celebrities, billionaires, athletes, and influencers whose combined social reach could amplify anyone's profile. For Harry, being absent was not an option. Not now. Not when every photograph, every appearance, every association could either reinforce his relevance or highlight his isolation. So the email was drafted. It was polite, careful, and by all accounts, diplomatic. But even the most carefully constructed message can carry subtext, unintentional hints of urgency or vulnerability. And this email, according to insiders, carried both. On the surface, it was a simple invitation request. May I join you at the F1 Grand Prix? But beneath that simple sentence lay layers of expectation, hope, and a subtle plea for validation. When Ben Affleck read the email, insiders say, it was immediately clear that Harry had underestimated the cultural and social nuances at play. Hollywood operates on unspoken rules. Timing, tone, social leverage, and the subtleties of personal history. What might appear courteous in one context can be perceived as overstepping in another. And in this case, the email, meant as a strategic request, read to Ben as presumptuous, slightly naive, and, according to whispers, even amusing. The room where Ben read the email is said to have been casual, filled with colleagues, industry friends, and associates who could easily relay stories. This wasn't a private correspondence. The dynamics of the setting amplified the reaction. A chuckle here, a raised eyebrow there. In Hollywood, subtle cues carry massive weight. Every gesture, every pause, every expression is interpreted, dissected, and cataloged. And when Ben allegedly reacted, it wasn't just a private judgment. It became an observed event, witnessed, and noted. But Harry's goal wasn't just to attend an event. It was to send a signal. I'm still relevant. I still have connections. I still matter. For him, visibility was survival. Every slight, every rejection, every moment of being sidelined was a blow to both his personal identity and his carefully managed public image. And that's where the tension escalates. Because what Ben allegedly said, and the room's reaction, created a fissure, a tiny crack that would grow into a chasm. This isn't just about celebrity etiquette. It's about human psychology. How do you respond when someone you admire, respect, or at least recognize, asks something of you that feels off the mark? How do you balance honesty with tact and maintain your own boundaries without creating public spectacle? Ben's alleged response, while shocking, was informed by these pressures. It was a reaction shaped by years of navigating fame, protecting privacy, and managing reputation. Harry, on the other hand, likely didn't anticipate the intensity of that reaction. The prince who walked into rooms with confidence, accustomed to people deferring to his status, suddenly found himself encountering the subtleties of Hollywood's social power. He was learning, perhaps for the first time, that in this world, influence is earned moment by moment, not granted by birthright. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. Because once the email was read and allegedly mocked, the ripple effects began. Whispers traveled quickly. Someone in the room shared a screenshot. A casual comment became a story became a rumor, and a rumor began to shape perceptions across continents. What started as a simple request turned into a narrative of rejection, embarrassment, and subtle public humiliation. Even more intriguing is the psychology behind the leak. Sources suggest that those who witnessed the reaction didn't intend to harm Harry personally. It was curiosity, humor, the sheer audacity of a prince asking to join a Hollywood icon that made the moment irresistible. But as the story spread, the stakes escalated. Social media, private messages, and news outlets became unintended participants, amplifying the drama. For Harry, the lesson was stark. In Hollywood, no title protects you. In the digital age, even private communications can become public currency. A single email, once intended as a polite request, can morph into a symbol of miscalculation, misjudgment, and misplaced expectation. And yet, despite the embarrassment, Harry's intent was clear. He wasn't asking to make enemies. He was seeking connection. He was testing relevance. He was trying to remind the world, and perhaps himself, that he still had influence, still had allies, still mattered in arenas where his presence could shape perception and media narrative. But Hollywood isn't forgiving. It doesn't measure intent, it measures impact. And the impact of this single email, read in the wrong room at the wrong time, was immediate and devastating. What's more, insiders say that this wasn't the last time Harry would encounter such a collision of expectation and reality. The F1 Grand Prix, which had seemed like a stage for potential triumph, was quickly turning into a high-stakes chessboard, with pieces moving in ways he hadn't anticipated. Alliances, appearances, and reputations were being recalculated in real time. And at the center of it all was one man, Ben Affleck, whose reaction and alleged words would reverberate far beyond the confines of Las Vegas. But the moment didn't end there. Because what happened after the email was read, what Ben allegedly said next, and the ripple effects that followed, would create a story that crossed continents, cultures, and conversations. A story that would make headlines, inspire gossip, and leave Harry wondering if strategic alliances were even possible in this new world of celebrity and perception. It wasn't just the content of the email that mattered. It was where and how it landed in Ben Affleck's world. Hollywood emails are normally filtered through layers of assistants, managers, and PR teams. Messages from unexpected sources can get buried, ignored, or deleted. But somehow, This one cut through the noise and landed directly in Ben's inbox at a very precise, very volatile moment. The story begins in Los Angeles, in a sleek, modern office that screamed understated Hollywood chic. Ben was there with a few trusted colleagues, sipping on espresso, reviewing upcoming projects, and checking schedules. It was supposed to be a routine day, but then an email pinged, different from the usual inquiries. Different from the fan mail, the scheduling confirmations, the routine business. The sender? Prince Harry. The subject line, innocuous but tinged with expectation. F1 Grand Prix, Las Vegas invitation request. Ben glanced at it casually at first. He was known for being private, for carefully managing who he communicated with directly. Emails from royalty weren't exactly daily occurrences, but they weren't shocking either. Yet this one felt off. Something in the phrasing, the tone, even the timing, caught his eye. According to insiders, it wasn't a malicious or aggressive email, but it had a subtle air of self-importance that rubbed him the wrong way. It was then that the room noticed a change in his expression, a subtle furrow of the brow, a twitch of the lips. Those who know Ben say he rarely shows strong reactions immediately. He's careful, measured, strategic. But this email? It seemed to bypass the usual filters of his composure. And in a room of curious colleagues, that reaction became the first spark of what would later be described as a Hollywood stunning moment. The email's content, by all accounts, started politely. Harry wrote about wanting to attend the F1 Grand Prix, subtly noting mutual connections and past encounters with people in Hollywood circles. But there was more than just a request. It was an implied assumption of access. That assumption, insiders say, struck a nerve. Because in Hollywood, assumptions about access can either open doors or shut them with a painful finality. Ben, according to sources, didn't just read the email silently. He read it aloud. Not word for word, but enough to convey tone, intent, and, most importantly, the unintended humor embedded in certain phrasing. The room shifted. Someone chuckled. A pause, a glance exchanged. And suddenly, a private message became a public performance. But why read it aloud at all? Ben's reasoning, as insiders speculate, was not cruelty, it was instinct. He needed to process it out loud, to gauge the reactions of people he trusted. Hollywood, after all, thrives on collaboration and feedback. Reading it aloud is a common tactic to gauge tone and intention. But in this case, it had consequences he perhaps didn't anticipate. Then came the laughter. Not malicious, but unmistakable. A subtle teasing, a ripple of incredulity. To Ben's team, the email was a moment of levity. To Harry, it was a request rooted in strategy and hope. The collision of these perspectives is where things began to unravel. And it wasn't just about humor. It was about context. Ben had been dealing with constant media attention, rumors, and pressures. His world was already a minefield of gossip and speculation. And when an email from a British prince entered the equation, one that carried both innocence and audacity, it acted like a spark in a dry forest. The emotional response was magnified, observed, and, inevitably, remembered. The F1 Grand Prix itself only heightened the stakes. It was the event everyone in both Hollywood and elite social circles had circled on their calendars. Being seen, being photographed, being associated with the right people. These weren't just perks. They were vital to maintaining influence and relevance. For Harry, the email was a ticket. For Ben, it was a test of boundaries. And the room's reaction underscored the tension. But here's the twist. Insiders say the moment wasn't purely negative. There was also curiosity, intrigue, and a hint of admiration buried beneath the laughter. Because, in a way, sending the email took courage. Reaching out across worlds, across continents, and asking for inclusion required vulnerability. A vulnerability that most public figures rarely display openly. Yet Hollywood doesn't reward vulnerability in isolation. It rewards calculated presence, timing, and social tact. And that's where the disconnect happened. Harry had assumed that his title, past fame, and connections would guarantee at least consideration. But Hollywood operates on different rules. Rules that prize timing, perception, and context over pedigree. As Ben read the email aloud, insiders describe a subtle escalation. Eyebrows raised, smirks exchanged, whispered comments, lighthearted in intent, began to shape a narrative. And this narrative wasn't confined to that room. Emails get forwarded. Gossip spreads. Screenshots travel. Within hours, what started as a private attempt to join an event had become a story whispered among Hollywood insiders. Meanwhile, Harry remained unaware of the initial reaction. His focus was still on the event itself, planning, strategizing, and hoping that a positive response would secure his attendance. What he didn't realize was that social dynamics had shifted the moment the email was opened. Access wasn't just denied, it was subtly mocked. And in a world where perception equals reality, that mockery was more damaging than a flat refusal. There's an irony here that insiders emphasize. A prince, accustomed to walking into rooms with guaranteed respect and immediate acknowledgement, suddenly found himself navigating the very uncertainties that any public figure in Hollywood must face. Privilege only carries you so far. Influence requires a nuanced understanding of social power, and Harry was learning that lesson in real time. The email's journey didn't end there. A single forwarded message, a casual retelling of the scene, and suddenly, the story traveled faster than any formal announcement could. Laughter turned into gossip. Gossip turned into speculation. And speculation set the stage for the next level of drama, one that would involve not just Hollywood, but international attention. But what made this moment truly pivotal wasn't just the email or Ben's reaction. It was the aftershock. Once the news, whispers, and screenshots reached the right people, it ignited a chain reaction. Advisors, friends, and insiders began calculating consequences. How would this reflect on Harry? What could this mean for future attempts at networking? And crucially, what doors had just closed, permanently or temporarily, because of one email read aloud? By the end of that day, the F1 Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It had become a symbol. A battleground where status, influence, and perception collided. Harry's attempt to reclaim relevance had unintentionally exposed vulnerabilities he had rarely revealed publicly. And Ben Affleck, whether intentionally or not, had become a central figure in a story that would ripple far beyond Las Vegas. As night fell over Los Angeles, insiders say that Harry was still unaware of the unfolding chaos. His email, his intentions, his hopes, all were in motion, yet disconnected from the reality of the response it had triggered. And that disconnect would only grow as the days leading to the F1 event progressed, shaping the narrative in ways no one could have anticipated. The devil, as they say, is in the details. And in Harry's email, every carefully chosen word carried weight, intended or not. From the moment it landed in Ben Affleck's inbox, the message wasn't just a request, it was a window into a world few outsiders ever see. The mind of a prince who had grown accustomed to influence, yet was suddenly navigating a realm where titles didn't carry automatic respect. The email began innocuously. Harry greeted Ben warmly, referencing past mutual acquaintances, some shared experiences at charity events, and subtly noting his admiration for the actor's work. On the surface, it sounded polite, professional, even charming. But as any insider familiar with Hollywood etiquette will tell you, charm is one thing. Assumptions are another entirely. And the email, according to sources, straddled that fine line in ways that would make anyone pause. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't demanding. But it carried a faint, almost imperceptible tone of expectation. Almost as if Harry was saying, I assume you'll consider this favor because of who I am, and because we share connections. To Ben, the assumption may have read as bold, misplaced, or even naive. And in Hollywood, bold can be dangerous if it's misaligned with context. What happened next, insiders claim, is a mix of instinct, social awareness, and a hint of humor. Ben read portions of the email aloud, not to mock it first, but to process the tone and phrasing. And yet, as soon as the room caught on, subtle chuckles and raised eyebrows began to ripple through the group. That small reaction, seemingly innocuous, was the spark that would ignite the next wave of drama. The phrasing that allegedly caused the most amusement involved Harry's proposed role at the F1 Grand Prix. He wrote with the confidence of someone used to being in the spotlight, detailing potential appearances, visibility opportunities, and networking moments, all meant to convey that his attendance would be mutually beneficial. But for Hollywood insiders accustomed to precise social maneuvering, it read like overreach. It was ambitious, yes, but also a little overcalculated. There's a thin line between strategic initiative and presumption, and this email skirted it dangerously. Layered within the message, according to leaks, were other elements that compounded the effect. Harry made references to shared acquaintances, hinted at prior favors, and suggested potential collaborations, none of which were inherently inappropriate, but each carried subtle implications. To Ben, accustomed to carefully reading between the lines of every request he receives, the subtext was glaring. The room, observing, couldn't help but notice the contrast. A prince expecting automatic consideration in a world where influence must constantly be proven. The humor wasn't malicious at first. It came from the incongruity of the situation. A man born into global prominence suddenly making a request that, while courteous, highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in crossing worlds. Hollywood thrives on timing, social intuition, and the unspoken hierarchy of access. A misstep, even a polite one, becomes immediately apparent. And Harry's email, for better or worse, showcased the delicate balancing act between confidence and expectation, revealing cracks that insiders say were impossible to ignore. Then came the line that insiders describe as the kicker. Harry referenced a particular connection that he assumed would guarantee positive reception. A nod to a previous event or acquaintance he thought would serve as social leverage. But this line, instead of serving as an advantage, inadvertently highlighted the audacity of the request. In a space where social proof is everything, it suggested entitlement rather than alignment. For the people observing, the effect was immediate: laughter, raised eyebrows, and whispers. For Harry, unaware of the reaction, it was a subtle miscalculation with enormous consequences. But why did it spark such strong reactions, beyond phrasing? Because context matters. The F1 Grand Prix isn't just an event. It's a spectacle where the stakes of appearance, perception, and association are sky-high. Attending isn't merely about watching cars race. It's about being seen, being photographed, and being connected to the right people at precisely the right moment. And in that universe, even minor errors in tone or expectation can trigger outsized responses. Harry's email, polite yet presumptive, collided with Hollywood's social calculus in a way insiders say was almost comical, if it weren't so serious for the prince himself. Meanwhile, the audience in the room, the colleagues and associates of Ben Affleck, watched carefully. Laughter and whispers spread like wildfire. Each chuckle wasn't just reaction, it was judgment, a microcosm of how Hollywood reacts to perceived overreach. And once that energy is released, it's difficult to contain. Stories evolve, whispers circulate, and context can be lost. By the time Harry learned of the reaction, the narrative had already shifted from request to moment of public embarrassment. Yet, despite the amusement, there was an undeniable undertone of admiration buried in the interaction. Sending an email across worlds, bridging continents, institutions, and social hierarchies, requires courage. Harry demonstrated initiative, attempting to assert influence in a space where he had no automatic claim. That bravery, however misaligned with social expectations, is what insiders suggest kept the story from being outright ridicule. Instead, it became a mixture of humor, disbelief, and curiosity. This dichotomy, courage versus miscalculation, is precisely what makes the story so compelling. It raises questions about the nature of influence, the limits of privilege, and the fine line between expectation and overreach. How much does a title carry when the norms of another world operate under entirely different rules? How much influence can a prince wield when entering a space governed by perception, timing, and insider awareness? And it wasn't just the content of the email that mattered. The medium amplified the stakes. Digital communication leaves traces. Screenshots can be shared, tone can be misread, and once words are out of the inbox, they're no longer private. Insiders indicate that Ben's reaction, combined with the way the email was handled in the room, created a situation ripe for exposure. The story wasn't just about an email. It became a narrative about status, boundaries, and social intelligence. The F1 Grand Prix, poised to be a high-visibility event, suddenly loomed as the stage for consequences. A single message, interpreted in multiple ways, had the potential to affect not just attendance but perception, relationships, and future opportunities. Harry's calculated move, intended to secure a place, was now a lesson in the fragility of influence. A subtle misstep, insiders suggest, can escalate faster than anyone anticipates. By the end of the email saga in that room, a quiet tension settled. Chuckles faded, but the moment lingered. Observers whispered. Screenshots moved. The narrative began to solidify in the minds of those who saw it unfold. Harry, the prince, had crossed into a world where his assumptions no longer guaranteed access. Hollywood, unlike royalty, demanded nuance, subtlety, and above all, respect for its social order. And as for Harry, the lessons were just beginning. The email had done more than request attendance. It had exposed vulnerabilities, revealed miscalculations, and set in motion a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the inbox. The moment Ben Affleck read Prince Harry's email, insiders say, the tension in the room shifted. There was a subtle energy change, an almost imperceptible tightening of facial muscles, the kind of human reaction that says, I need to process this carefully. But processing it wasn't just about reading words. It was about context, history, and instinct. Hollywood, like royalty, runs on nuanced social cues, unspoken hierarchies, and a delicate dance of perception. And in that universe, every request is a test. Ben's alleged reaction, according to multiple insiders, was not casual dismissal. It was frustration, sharp, contained, yet unmistakable. What caused it? There were several factors at play, each intertwined with the invisible rules that govern elite social circles. First, there was the matter of timing. Ben was in the middle of a hectic schedule, balancing professional obligations, public appearances, and personal pressures. He was acutely aware of the optics of any interaction. A prince reaching out for access, a request framed politely yet tinged with expectation, created an immediate ethical and social dilemma. How do you respond without creating offense? How do you maintain composure while protecting privacy? For Ben, this was a moment that demanded both honesty and subtlety, a rare combination to pull off flawlessly. Then there was the nature of the request itself. It wasn't just a casual ask, it carried an implicit expectation. Harry was seeking entry into a world that operates differently from royalty. In Hollywood, status is constantly negotiated, influence is earned, and boundaries are respected according to unwritten social contracts. An email that assumes access, even politely, can be interpreted as audacious. And when combined with the high visibility of the F1 Grand Prix, the stakes became enormous. Ben's response wasn't merely a reaction to Harry. It was a response to an intersection of worlds, a collision between privilege and protocol, royalty and celebrity. Insiders described the scene in detail. Ben read the email aloud, dissecting tone and phrasing, emphasizing certain lines that seemed overconfident. Laughter and murmurs spread through the room, not cruel, but a natural human reaction to incongruity. Here was a man used to commanding attention, now navigating a sphere where influence could not be assumed. Ben's frustration, though subtle, was amplified by context. It wasn't personal animosity. It was an instinctive defense against social misalignment. At the same time, Hollywood thrives on observation. Every reaction, every pause, every smirk carries meaning. Those present in the room noticed the tension. One insider remarked that Ben's eyes flicked across the room as if measuring the consequences. This moment, according to sources, was emblematic of how high-stakes social intelligence operates in elite circles. The email wasn't just read, it was interpreted, analyzed, and judged. But there was another dimension. Ben Affleck, unlike some Hollywood figures, values discretion. He has weathered scandals, paparazzi scrutiny, and public pressure. His reputation for measured responses and careful management of private interactions is well documented. That history likely informed his alleged reaction. When Harry's email crossed into perceived overreach, Ben's instinct may have been to respond internally, but the environment made it impossible to remain purely private. Laughter, whispers, and subtle cues from others shaped a response that combined surprise, amusement, and controlled frustration. This is where human psychology enters the story. Responses to perceived entitlement are often amplified by context. When someone from a position of power reaches into a domain where power is earned differently, tension arises. Ben's frustration, insiders suggest, wasn't malicious. It was a natural human reaction to an unexpected request, magnified by observation, social pressure, and the novelty of the situation. Meanwhile, Harry remained unaware of the reaction at that moment. His intention had been straightforward, a polite request to attend a high-profile event. He likely assumed his status, connections, and prior public presence would smooth the way. But the email highlighted a subtle truth. Even royalty is subject to the norms of other domains, and assumptions of access can misfire in unpredictable ways. Then came the forward. According to sources, someone in the room, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps intentionally, forwarded portions of the email to a trusted network. Within hours, what had been a private interaction became fodder for whispers. Screenshots circulated, gossip spread, and the narrative began to take shape, framing Harry as overreaching, audacious, or out of touch. The impact on his public image, however indirect at first, began to mount. What's fascinating, insiders say, is how quickly perception can alter reality. An email, read aloud, misinterpreted or laughed at in a private setting, becomes a story. That story becomes a reputation. And in high-stakes environments like Hollywood and international media, reputation can shift overnight. For Harry, what had been a strategic request now carried unanticipated consequences, subtle embarrassment, reputational risk, and a new understanding of how influence operates outside the royal sphere. And yet, there were lessons embedded in this incident. Courage, initiative, and persistence are crucial, but so is timing, social intelligence, and context. Harry had demonstrated boldness, reaching out directly, bypassing intermediaries, and seeking inclusion in a high-visibility environment. The miscalculation wasn't lack of effort, it was lack of alignment with Hollywood's intricate social ecosystem. The aftermath in Hollywood wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Whispers escalated to stories. Stories reached insiders. Insiders reached social media circles. And suddenly, the email was no longer just a request, it was a symbol of misjudged timing, a reminder that influence must be cultivated, and an emblem of how even those born into privilege must navigate new social dynamics with care. Ben's response, whether intentionally sharp or instinctively measured, had ripple effects. The prince learned, subtly but definitively, that the rules of influence differ dramatically between royalty and celebrity. What commands attention in one world may be disregarded or misinterpreted in another. And while Harry had once walked into rooms with unquestioned authority, the Hollywood ecosystem operated on observation, timing, and social alignment. By the time the day ended, the email had triggered a sequence of events that no one could fully control. Gossip, perception, and subtle judgment had combined to create a narrative that would travel from Hollywood offices to social media feeds and back across the Atlantic. A single request, intended to secure attendance at a prestigious event, had morphed into a lesson in power, perception, and human behavior. And as the night fell, the F1 Grand Prix loomed on the horizon, not just as a race, but as a stage for lessons learned, reputations tested, and consequences awaited. The email had been read, the reaction noted, and the ripple effects had begun. Harry's world of assumed influence had collided with the complex, nuanced, and unforgiving environment of Hollywood. By the time the Las Vegas F1 Grand Prix was just weeks away, what began as a private, diplomatic email had already taken on a life of its own. Prince Harry had no idea that his carefully worded request, meant to secure a strategic foothold in Hollywood, had been observed, dissected, and whispered about by insiders in Ben Affleck's inner circle. But as anyone familiar with the entertainment world will tell you, once a moment is witnessed, its trajectory is almost impossible to control. The leak didn't start with malice. It started with fascination. Insiders say that someone in the room, perhaps a colleague of Ben's, found the situation too unusual to keep to themselves. A prince, an email, an audacious request. It was the kind of story that made the mundane crackle with intrigue. In Hollywood, gossip is currency, and moments like these, rare and unexpected, are almost always shared with someone who needs to know. That first whisper, as subtle as it seemed, acted like a match lighting a fuse. One person mentioned it in passing to another, highlighting the audacity of the request and the bemusement in the room. Another laughed and forwarded a partial screenshot. Suddenly, what was private was semi-public. And in a space as interconnected as Hollywood, semi-public quickly becomes viral. The leak was amplified because of the people involved. Ben Affleck is not just an actor. He is a symbol of insider credibility, someone whose judgment carries weight. When news spreads that someone of his stature had a strong reaction to a prince's email, the story gains traction beyond the walls of a single office. It becomes a topic of discussion in social circles, at lunch tables, in private texts, and eventually, across social media platforms where every detail is magnified and dissected. Insiders describe the process with almost surgical precision. The email itself, amusing to some, became the nucleus. Ben's alleged reaction. The raised eyebrow, the subtle smirk, the careful articulation of surprise, served as the spark. Observers' whispers acted as kindling. Screenshots and forwarded messages became sparks that ignited a wildfire, traveling far faster than anyone in the room could anticipate. For Harry, this represented a series of escalating challenges he could never have foreseen. He had assumed discretion. He had assumed privacy. And yet, the very moment he sought inclusion into a social environment, he had inadvertently opened a door to scrutiny. It was a harsh lesson in how influence operates outside the royal sphere. Access is not guaranteed, and exposure can be immediate and unrelenting. And the consequences were not just personal, they were strategic. Hollywood insiders began to gauge the implications of the leak, considering what it meant for alliances, future events, and social dynamics. The email had transformed from a simple request to a signal of vulnerability, a subtle but undeniable indicator that even a prince could misstep. This made the story irresistible. By the next day, the whispers had grown louder. Sources indicate that journalists began catching wind of the situation through unofficial channels. Some viewed it as a humorous anecdote, a prince trying to crash Hollywood with an email. Others, however, sensed a more serious undercurrent. Influence, access, and perception were all at stake. The prince's status, normally unquestioned in the royal sphere, was suddenly being tested in a realm where reputation is fragile and earned, not inherited. Compounding the situation was the timing. Social media cycles move faster than any royal press office can respond. Screenshots were shared on platforms where perception becomes reality. Memes, jokes, and speculative commentary began circulating. Every forwarded message, every whispered retelling added layers to the story, creating a narrative Harry had no control over. What was once a polite request had become fodder for gossip, analysis, and public speculation, all before he had even received a response. But why did the leak spiral so quickly? Partly, it was human nature. Stories that combine audacity, power, and humor are irresistible. People are naturally drawn to moments where the high-status individual stumbles or miscalculates. In this case, Harry's email had unintentionally highlighted a contrast. A man used to commanding rooms, suddenly navigating spaces where influence must be earned differently. That contrast, insiders say, was almost theatrical in its impact. Moreover, Hollywood is a world obsessed with narratives. Every action, even the most mundane, is interpreted as part of a larger story. Harry's request, observed and reacted to by Ben, became a narrative about miscalculation, audacity, and vulnerability. Once the story is perceived as compelling, it takes on a life of its own. It spreads not because of malice, but because of intrigue, humor, and the natural human appetite for drama. By the time the leak reached outside observers, it was no longer just an anecdote. It had become a cautionary tale, a moment of insight into how two worlds, royalty and Hollywood, intersect, clash, and collide. Sources close to Ben described the situation as delicate but fascinating, noting that while the reaction may have seemed sharp, it reflected the inherent challenges of managing social dynamics across vastly different cultural spheres. And Harry, caught in the center, was only beginning to grasp the implications. He had entered the Hollywood ecosystem with confidence, relying on his status, connections, and charm. But the email incident revealed a critical truth. Even the most strategic moves can misfire when context, perception, and social nuance are misaligned. What's more, insiders report that the leak prompted a ripple effect that reached far beyond Hollywood. Royal advisors, once oblivious to the email, were now aware. Family members, long accustomed to the protective bubble surrounding the prince, began to hear whispers. Each retelling subtly reshaped perception. The prince was bold, yes, but perhaps too bold. Ambitious, yes, but maybe naive. By the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. Screenshots circulated, private interpretations were shared, and the narrative of Harry's audacious F1 request became a symbol of a larger truth. Status is situational, influence is fragile, and a single miscalculation can reverberate across continents. And yet, despite the embarrassment, insiders suggest that Harry remained determined. His focus had shifted from the initial email to the broader implications. How would he respond? How could he reclaim control? And how could he navigate an event as high-profile and unforgiving as the Las Vegas Grand Prix? The stakes had grown exponentially, transforming a simple outreach into a high-stakes game of perception, strategy, and influence. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Someone outside the immediate circle, someone who had previously remained silent, decided to step in. And their involvement, according to insiders, would escalate the situation in ways Harry could not have anticipated. It wasn't long before whispers of Harry's audacious email crossed the Atlantic. What had begun as a private, humorous, and slightly awkward moment in a Hollywood office suddenly reached the ears of people who lived and breathed caution, reputation, and control, royal insiders. For them, news of a prince's misstep outside the palace walls wasn't just interesting, it was alarming. The reaction inside the palace was immediate. Advisors convened in hushed meetings, attempting to assess the magnitude of the leak. Some argued it was minor, an isolated Hollywood anecdote unlikely to impact public perception. Others viewed it as a symptom of a larger issue. Harry, increasingly removed from the traditional structures of royal life, was operating in spaces where his natural authority carried little weight. Hollywood, a world of scrutiny, social dynamics, and carefully curated reputations, was not accustomed to royal protocols, and the prince's email had inadvertently revealed that. Inside these meetings, the stakes were clear. The palace had spent decades carefully crafting the image of its members. Each public appearance, each press statement, each engagement was calculated to maintain dignity, influence, and authority. And here was a story circulating, not maliciously, perhaps, but undeniably, about a prince who had overstepped boundaries and been publicly mocked. The potential fallout wasn't just embarrassment. It could be interpreted as incompetence, misjudgment, or a lack of social awareness, all dangerous perceptions for someone whose status relies on symbolic authority. Insiders describe a whirlwind of emotions: frustration, concern, mild panic, and, in some quarters, bemusement. How could someone so accustomed to influence miscalculate so dramatically in a setting outside the palace? It was a question that dominated conversations in both official and informal spaces. Staff were asked to track media mentions, gauge potential leaks, and prepare statements or talking points should journalists or the public inquire. The palace was bracing for scrutiny, even though, officially, the story remained unverified. The nature of the email itself was dissected repeatedly. Advisors analyzed every line, every phrase, every implication. They asked hard questions. Was Harry acting recklessly? Was this a pattern of behavior? Could this incident undermine his credibility in other high-profile engagements? Even the smallest details, seemingly trivial in a Hollywood context, were significant in royal terms. In the eyes of palace observers, this email wasn't just a minor faux pas. It was evidence of how drastically the prince's social strategy had shifted and how unprepared he was for worlds beyond ceremonial influence. Meanwhile, some insiders quietly admired Harry's initiative. After all, sending the email required courage, ambition, and a willingness to assert oneself outside the confines of traditional royal circles. But admiration was tempered by concern. In the palace, appearances are everything, and a misstep, even unintentional, can be magnified, spun, and remembered long after the moment has passed. For advisors accustomed to meticulous planning and controlled messaging, the spontaneity of Harry's approach was a red flag. The concern wasn't just hypothetical. Social media, though not directly mentioned in palace briefings, was alive with speculation. Screenshots, forwarded messages, and whispered accounts began circulating. Some journalists caught wind of the story through secondary channels, sharing light-hearted commentary and subtly framing Harry as audacious, perhaps even naive. For the palace, the speed and unpredictability of this narrative made it difficult to contain. Yet the story also highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Even a prince, no matter how globally recognized, is not immune to misinterpretation, ridicule, or social misalignment in spaces outside his traditional realm. Hollywood operates under rules fundamentally different from those in the royal sphere. Influence must be earned moment by moment, through perception, behavior, and alignment with social norms. Harry had assumed his stature would carry him. The reaction to the email revealed otherwise. Royal insiders began to strategize. Some proposed subtle interventions, advising Harry on future outreach, coaching him on language, tone, and timing. Others suggested indirect methods, ensuring that any further attempts to integrate into high-profile social events were coordinated with palace-approved channels. The consensus was clear. The prince's personal outreach, while well-intentioned, had inadvertently exposed vulnerabilities that could have long-term consequences. Beyond the immediate reaction, the incident also sparked internal debates. Was this merely an isolated misstep, or a symptom of a broader trend? Was Harry increasingly relying on external validation from Hollywood elites, rather than reinforcing influence within the structures he still controlled? Did the email reveal a growing gap between perception and strategy, a gap that, if unaddressed, could have reputational ramifications? These questions dominated conversations behind palace doors, highlighting the gravity of what outsiders might perceive as a minor anecdote. And yet, amidst the concern and analysis, there was a degree of irony. The email, intended as a bridge to Hollywood influence, had inadvertently strengthened one truth. The boundaries between celebrity and royalty are more rigid than many assume. Influence is context-dependent, and no amount of status guarantees access. The palace's reaction underscored the fragility of reputation in uncharted social territories. Some insiders reportedly reached out to trusted advisors in Hollywood, attempting to understand the narrative firsthand. They sought to gauge the reactions, anticipate the spread, and strategize containment, though the viral nature of the incident made containment nearly impossible. Within hours, informal discussions about the email circulated, each retelling adding layers of interpretation, some humorous, some critical, and some bordering on scandalous. For Harry, the lessons were becoming clear. Initiative alone is not enough. Strategic awareness and contextual sensitivity are essential. One miscalculation, even a seemingly polite request, can spiral into perceptional and reputational challenges far beyond the immediate context. The email had served as both opportunity and test, and the reaction of those involved illuminated the delicate balance of influence, access, and perception. As discussions continued behind palace walls, advisors began crafting scenarios, anticipating questions, and preparing for eventual public scrutiny. The F1 Grand Prix loomed closer, and every social interaction, every potential photograph, and every engagement became critical. The stakes were no longer just about attending an event. They were about safeguarding credibility, maintaining influence, and navigating the complex intersections of celebrity and royalty. And then came the next twist. Someone, previously silent, chose to intervene, not officially, not formally, but in a way that would escalate the situation beyond palace walls. This decision, insiders say, would dramatically reshape the trajectory of the email incident, taking it from a private embarrassment to a moment of international intrigue and scrutiny. The Las Vegas Grand Prix was not just a race. It was a spectacle, a convergence of wealth, influence, and the kind of glamour that defines headlines for months. For someone like Prince Harry, who had spent years navigating both the limelight and the shadows of global attention, this was more than an event. It was an opportunity to be seen, to connect, and to reclaim relevance in circles that had begun to drift away. For Hollywood, Las Vegas, and elite sports aficionados, the F1 Grand Prix represents the apex of spectacle. Celebrities arrive in private jets, billionaire business magnates host exclusive parties, and the world watches. Cameras capture every handshake, every smile, every entry and exit. Attendance is a badge of influence, a public demonstration that you matter in the right circles. To be excluded is to signal irrelevance. And for Harry, exclusion was not an option. But why was the F1 so critical for him? For starters, visibility. After stepping back from royal duties, Harry's appearances have been carefully curated, often through controlled media opportunities. But a public event like the Grand Prix exposes you to a wider, more influential audience. Every photo taken, every interaction, every casual smile could influence public perception, Hollywood alliances, and even potential partnerships. Missing the F1 would not just be a logistical oversight. It would be a missed opportunity to assert relevance in the spaces he increasingly relied on. Then there's the social currency. Events like the Grand Prix are a microcosm of influence. Seating arrangements, table placements, and proximity to other high-profile guests can shift power dynamics. For someone like Harry, whose influence is no longer automatic, gaining access meant participating in that currency. Every conversation, every appearance, and every captured image contributed to a carefully calibrated narrative, one where presence equals relevance. Insiders reveal that Harry's desperation wasn't rooted in arrogance, it was strategic anxiety. He understood that perception matters as much as presence. Hollywood is a world where moments are amplified and missteps are remembered. One awkward encounter, one denied request, and a narrative of irrelevance can solidify. The Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It was a platform to counteract potential narratives of decline and demonstrate vitality, charm, and influence in real time. And then there was the timing. The Grand Prix coincided with a period of heightened scrutiny. Harry's recent engagements, both public and private, had drawn mixed reactions. Some praised his philanthropic work. Others criticized perceived missteps in handling personal matters and public appearances. In this environment, missing a high-visibility event would be perceived as weakness, disengagement, or irrelevance. Attending with Hollywood support was essential to demonstrating continued influence. The stakes were further elevated because of the people involved. The Grand Prix attracts A-list celebrities, global billionaires, and industry titans. Every handshake and photograph represents potential opportunities in media, film, or philanthropy. Harry was aware of the